I never thought my passion for camping would lead me to the most terrifying night of my life. The wilderness had always been my sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. I'd never imagined it could turn into a deadly game of survival. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd grown tired of the crowded campsites and noisy neighbors, so I chose a secluded spot deep in the Pine Creek forest, a place I'd read about online. The reviews were glowing: untouched beauty, serene atmosphere, and trails that led to breathtaking viewpoints. It seemed perfect. I arrived early in the afternoon. The sun was high, and the forest looked alive with golden light streaming through the tall pines. I parked my car at the trailhead, strapped on my backpack, and set off. The hike to the campsite was about 3 miles, a pleasant journey with the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirp of birds. By the time I reached the site, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows. The campsite was everything I'd hoped for: a flat clearing surrounded by towering trees, with a small creek running nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and prepared for a peaceful evening. As dusk settled, I lit a fire and cooked a simple meal. The crackling flames were comforting, their warmth a barrier against the encroaching chill. I sat there, enjoying the solitude, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and occasionally, a distant owl hooted. Around 10 p.m., I decided to turn in. The fire was dying, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I doused the embers with water, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and let the gentle rustle of the trees lull me to sleep. A snapping twig woke me. My eyes flew open, heart pounding. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but then I heard it again: footsteps. Human footsteps, slow and deliberate. My mind raced. Who else would be out here this deep in the forest in the dead of night? I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My tent was zipped shut, but I could see the faint outline of a shadow moving against the fabric. Someone was walking around my campsite. I reached for my phone, but my hands were trembling so much I nearly dropped it. I turned it on and stared at the screen, considering whether to call for help. But what would I say? That someone was walking around outside? Could easily be another camper who'd lost their way. Then, a low, guttural voice broke the silence. "You can't hide forever." My blood ran cold. This was no lost camper. Panic surged through me. I'd left my hunting knife outside with the rest of my gear. I was trapped inside my tent, defenseless. The shadow outside moved closer, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a zipper. My tent's zipper. Whoever it was, they were trying to get in. "Leave me alone," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The zipper stopped. There was a moment of silence, and then the voice again, this time closer. "Run. Let's see how far you'll get." Adrenaline took over. I scrambled out of the tent through the other side, ripping the fabric in my haste. I bolted into the woods, my flashlight the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Branches scratched my arms and face, but I didn't care. I could hear him behind me, his heavy boots crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I didn't know where I was going. The forest was a labyrinth, and in my panic, I'd lost all sense of direction. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. The man's voice echoed through the trees, taunting me. "You're making this fun," he called. I stumbled upon a narrow trail and followed it, hoping it would lead me back to the main path. My flashlight's beam flickered, the batteries dying. I cursed under my breath, pushing myself to move faster. Then, ahead, I saw a faint light, a cabin. I ran towards it, hope surging through me. The cabin was small and looked abandoned, but it had a door I could barricade. I burst inside and slammed the door shut, shoving an old wooden table against it. My flashlight finally gave out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone and turned on its light. The cabin was bare, just a single room with a rotting bed frame and a broken chair. I searched for anything I could use as a weapon and found a rusted hammer under the bed. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The man's footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. He was toying with me, enjoying the chase. Come out, wherever you are, he sang mockingly. I held the hammer tightly, my back pressed against the wall. The door rattled as he tried to open it. Then, with a loud crash, he kicked it in. The table skidded across the floor, and he stepped inside, his face obscured by the shadows. You shouldn't have run, he said, advancing towards me. I swung the hammer with all my strength, hitting him in the shoulder. He grunted in pain but didn't stop. He lunged at me, and we both fell to the floor, struggling. His hands closed around my throat, and I thought I was going to die. In my desperation, I groped for the hammer and managed to grab it. I swung again, this time hitting him square in the head. He collapsed, motionless. I didn't wait to see if he was alive or dead. I stumbled out of the cabin and ran until I found the main trail. Dawn was breaking by the time I reached the parking lot. My car was still there, and I jumped in, locking the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported what had happened. They sent a team to the cabin, but when they arrived, the man was gone. All they found was a pool of blood and the hammer I'd left behind. The rangers assured me they'd searched the area, but weeks passed with no news. The man had vanished, leaving no trace. I've never been back to Pine Creek Forest, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of that night haunts me, a constant reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't animals but people. I never thought an impulsive decision to explore an abandoned campground would turn into a nightmare I'd never forget. My friends and I had always been drawn to the thrill of urban exploration, but this time, I was alone. It was mid-October when I heard about the old Black Ridge campground. Once a bustling retreat for families, it had been shut down over a decade ago after a string of mysterious disappearances. The stories were vague, riddled with rumors of cult activity, and enough to deter most people. But for me, it was a challenge. I drove out late in the afternoon, following the winding forest road to the rusted gates of the campground. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive. I parked my car near the entrance, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped inside. The cabins were still standing, though they were in various states of decay. Broken windows, sagging roofs, and graffiti-covered walls told the story of years of abandonment. I wandered through the camp, taking pictures and exploring each structure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself in the main lodge. It was the largest building, once a place where campers gathered for meals and activities. Inside, the air was damp and stale. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight. I was examining an old bulletin board when I heard it, a faint creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. I froze, listening. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty room. No response. I told myself it was just the building settling, but my unease grew. I decided it was time to leave. As I made my way back to the entrance, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, fresh ones, leading deeper into the lodge. They weren't mine. Panic set in. I turned and hurried towards the exit, but the sound of footsteps behind me stopped me in my tracks. They weren't hurried or panicked. They were measured, deliberate. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. A figure stepped into the light, a man dressed in tattered clothes, his face partially obscured by a hood. His eyes glinted with something I can only describe as malice. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I didn't wait for him to say more. I bolted, sprinting through the lodge and out into the open. The cabins loomed like shadowy sentinels as I ran towards the gates. But no matter how fast I moved, I could hear him behind me, his footsteps unnervingly calm. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys in my panic. As I finally unlocked the door and jumped inside, he appeared just a few feet away, standing at the edge of the forest. He didn't chase me. He just stood there, watching as I sped away. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of my apartment. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but when they investigated, they found no trace of anyone. The lodge, the cabins, and the entire campground were empty. I've since learned that Black Ridge Campground has a dark reputation, not just for the disappearances but for the strange sightings and encounters reported by those who ventured there. I don't know who that man was or what his intentions were, but I do know one thing: I won't be going back. I never thought my fascination with remote hiking trails would lead me to the most harrowing experience of my life. Nature had always been my escape, a refuge from the clamor of everyday existence. But one isolated trip turned into a horrifying ordeal I'll never forget. It began on a crisp autumn morning when I decided to explore the Redwood Basin Trail, a secluded path I'd read about in a hiking forum. Described as a hidden gem, it was known for its stunning vistas and quiet atmosphere, untouched by the crowds that flocked to more popular spots. What the reviews didn't mention was how treacherous solitude could be. The trailhead was nearly an hour's drive from the nearest town. I parked my car in a gravel lot that was mostly empty save for an old, beat-up truck. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. I strapped on my backpack, checked my gear, and set off. The first few miles were idyllic. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the ground. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals. I felt a profound sense of peace, my worries melting away with each step. Around midday, I reached a clearing with a panoramic view of the valley below. I stopped to eat lunch, savoring the tranquility. It was then that I noticed something odd, a faint trail of smoke rising in the distance. It wasn't unusual for hunters or campers to be in the area, but something about it unsettled me. I brushed it off and continued on. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the trail became narrower and more overgrown. The trees seemed taller, their branches intertwining to block out the sun. A sense of unease began to creep in, but I attributed it to the isolation. I hadn't seen another soul since I started. By late afternoon, I decided to turn back. The forest felt different, heavier somehow, as if it were pressing in on me. I retraced my steps, but the landscape seemed unfamiliar. Landmarks I'd noted earlier were missing, replaced by dense thickets and unfamiliar terrain. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind. I was lost. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to orient myself. As I studied them, I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It echoed through the trees, too deliberate to be natural. My heart pounded as I scanned the forest, but I saw nothing. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I decided to keep moving, quickening my pace. Dusk was approaching, and the thought of being stranded overnight was terrifying. I stumbled upon a narrow, overgrown path that seemed to lead in the direction I'd come from. Relief washed over me as I followed it, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then I saw it. A crude structure made of branches and leaves, hidden among the trees. It looked like a shelter, hastily constructed but large enough for someone to live in. Curiosity battled with fear as I approached. Inside, I found a collection of items: a tattered sleeping bag, empty cans, and a rusty knife. Scrawled on the walls of the shelter were strange symbols and words I couldn't understand. A sudden noise behind me made me whip around. Standing a few yards away was a man. His clothes were dirty and torn, his face gaunt and unshaven. He stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and menacing. I tried to explain, my words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm just hiking. I got lost. I didn't mean to." "Leave," he interrupted, taking a step closer. "Now." I nodded, backing away slowly. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move calmly until I was out of sight. Then, I broke into a sprint, crashing through the underbrush. The sound of footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate. I tripped over a root and fell hard, the impact jarring my whole body. Scrambling to my feet, I turned to see the man emerging from the trees, his expression unreadable. In his hand was the rusty knife from the shelter. Desperation fueled me. I grabbed a thick branch from the ground and held it in front of me like a weapon. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't stop. I swung the branch as he lunged, hitting him in the arm. He staggered but didn't go down. I swung again, this time connecting with his shoulder. He let out a guttural growl and dropped the knife. I seized the opportunity and ran, leaving the weapon behind. The forest seemed endless, a maze designed to trap me. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. The man's pursuit was relentless, his footsteps never far behind. As night fell, I stumbled upon an old ranger station, its windows boarded up and door hanging ajar. I dashed inside and barricaded the entrance with a broken table. The room was dark, save for the weak beam of my flashlight. I searched for anything useful and found a flare gun in a dusty cabinet. Clutching it tightly, I sat in the corner, every nerve on edge. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Just when I thought I was safe, I heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate. The door rattled as he tried to push it open. "You can't hide forever," he said, his voice dripping with malice. I aimed the flare gun at the door, my hands shaking. When the door finally gave way, I fired. The flare hit him square in the chest, igniting his clothes. He screamed, a horrifying sound that will haunt me forever, and stumbled back into the night. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran until I found the main road and flagged down a passing car. The driver took me to the nearest town, where I reported everything to the authorities. A search party was sent out, but they found no trace of the man or his shelter. The ranger station was abandoned, its records indicating it had been out of use for years. To this day, I don't know who he was or why he targeted me. The Redwood Basin Trail has since been closed, deemed unsafe for hikers. I've never returned to the woods, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of that night lingers, a constant reminder that the greatest dangers often come from those who hide in the shadows. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying the content. As a college student, I work hard to create these videos, and I edit everything on my mobile phone. I'm hoping to upgrade to a laptop to improve the quality of my videos, but I don't want to ask for money directly. This Christmas, if you enjoy what I do, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could consider subscribing to the channel. It would mean the world to me. Your support helps me so much as I continue working toward my goals. Wishing you all a very Merry Christmas. May this festive season bring you joy and warmth. Thanks again for your support, and stay tuned for more.